General Alfredo Graziani stood at the porthole of the American transport ship USS Wakefield, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from New York Harbor's morning mist with a mixture of fascination and dread. Just 6 weeks earlier, he had been commanding the Italian 10th Army's armored division in Tunisia, confident that Axis forces would drive the Allied invaders back into the Mediterranean. Now, as one of the highest-ranking Italian prisoners of war ever captured, he faced the humiliating prospect of spending the remainder of the conflict in enemy custody. The 48-year-old career officer from Milan had built his reputation during Mussolini's Ethiopian campaign, where his tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to fascist ideology had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. His aristocratic bearing and passionate belief in Italian racial superiority had made him a model of the new fascist military leadership that Il Duce envisioned would restore Italy to the glory of ancient Rome. Beside him at the ship's rail stood Colonel James Patterson, the American intelligence officer responsible for escorting high-value prisoners to detention facilities in the United States. Patterson, a soft-spoken attorney from Chicago who had volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor, represented everything that Graziani had been taught to despise about American character: democratic ideals, racial equality, and what fascist propaganda portrayed as weakness disguised as tolerance. "General," Patterson said in careful Italian learned during his pre-war studies at the University of Bologna, "I hope you understand that you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention and with the respect due to your rank. America believes in the dignity of all prisoners, regardless of the circumstances of their capture." Graziani's response was formal and cold. "I require no special consideration from my captors. I am a soldier of Italy and will conduct myself with honor, regardless of how long this temporary setback in our ultimate victory may last." The exchange reflected the ideological chasm between captor and prisoner that would make the coming months a profound education for both men. Graziani's arrival in America would challenge every assumption he held about democratic society, racial diversity, and the sources of national strength, while Patterson's supervision of the Italian general would test American principles of tolerance and rehabilitation. The intelligence value of capturing such a senior Italian officer had been recognized immediately by Allied command. Graziani possessed detailed knowledge of Axis military plans, troop dispositions, and strategic thinking that could prove crucial for planning the invasion of Italy itself. However, his cooperation would depend on American ability to demonstrate that their cause was more than mere military superiority, that it represented a superior way of organizing human society. The telegram that had reached the War Department 3 days before Graziani's arrival outlined the unique challenges his captivity would present. Prisoner exhibits fanatical devotion to fascist ideology and Italian racial theories. Recommend assignment to facility where exposure to American democratic values and diversity might prove educationally valuable while maintaining security requirements. Fort Devens in Massachusetts had been selected as Graziani's destination, partly because of its proximity to industrial centers where he could observe American war production, and partly because of its diverse military and civilian population that would provide direct evidence of democratic society in action. The choice reflected a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare that emphasized demonstration over propaganda. As the ship docked at Brooklyn Navy Yard, Graziani observed his first close view of American society in wartime. The bustling activity of the port, with workers of obviously different ethnic backgrounds coordinating complex loading and unloading operations, provided immediate challenge to his preconceptions about racial hierarchy and social organization. "How can these people work together effectively?" he murmured to himself in Italian, watching a crew that included what appeared to be Italian Americans, Irish immigrants, African Americans, and recent arrivals from various European countries. The efficient coordination of their efforts contradicted everything he had been taught about the necessity of racial homogeneity for social effectiveness. Colonel Patterson, who had overheard the comment, chose not to respond directly but made mental notes about the general's obvious surprise at American diversity. The intelligence value of the prisoner might lie not only in military information he possessed, but also in his potential transformation through exposure to democratic values that contradicted fascist ideology. The train journey from New York to Boston provided Graziani with his first extended view of American society away from military environments. The passengers in his railway car, traveling under military guard but in civilian accommodations, represented a cross-section of American diversity that would have been impossible in fascist Italy or Nazi Germany. Seated across from him was Mrs. Sarah Goldman, a Jewish refugee from Germany whose husband was serving in the Army Corps of Engineers. Beside her sat Lieutenant Robert Washington, an African-American officer returning from training at West Point. In the forward seats, a Catholic priest conversed in Polish with what appeared to be recent immigrants, discussing their son's service in various branches of the American military. The casual interaction among these diverse passengers, their obvious mutual respect, despite racial and religious differences, provided Graziani with direct evidence that democratic societies could achieve social cohesion without the rigid hierarchies that fascist ideology claimed were necessary for national strength. In Italy, he wrote in his journal that evening, using a notebook provided by the Red Cross, such people would never travel together as equals. Jews, Africans, immigrants, they would know their proper places in society, yet here they seem to function as citizens with equal rights and responsibilities. I do not understand how this system can maintain order and purpose. The observation reflected the beginning of what would become a profound intellectual crisis for the Italian general. His entire worldview had been constructed around fascist theories of racial hierarchy and national purity that seemed to be contradicted by the evidence of his own eyes. Fort Devens presented an even more dramatic challenge to Graziani's preconceptions about military organization and effectiveness. The base population included soldiers from dozens of ethnic backgrounds, officers who had risen through merit rather than birth, and support personnel whose diversity would have been unthinkable in the Italian military hierarchy. Captain Maria Santos, the Mexican-American nurse who conducted Graziani's medical evaluation, represented everything that fascist ideology claimed was impossible. A woman of mixed heritage holding positions of responsibility and authority in military service. Her professional competence and obvious respect from both peers and superiors challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and racial capabilities. "General," she said in perfect English while checking his blood pressure, "I understand you commanded armored units in North Africa. My brother serves with the 761st Tank Battalion. Perhaps you encountered African-American tank crews during your service there." The casual reference to black Americans serving in combat roles that fascist propaganda claimed they were racially incapable of performing provided another shock to Graziani's ideological framework. His experience in Tunisia had indeed included encounters with segregated African-American units, whose fighting effectiveness had surprised Italian intelligence assessments. The mess hall at Fort Devens provided daily exposure to American military diversity that gradually wore down Graziani's resistance to evidence that contradicted his beliefs. The sight of soldiers from different backgrounds sharing meals, discussing tactics and displaying obvious camaraderie challenged his understanding of how armies were supposed to function. Sergeant Anthony Rossi, an Italian-American soldier from Boston whose family had immigrated just one generation earlier, had been assigned as one of Graziani's guards. The irony of being guarded by someone who might have been his countryman under different circumstances was not lost on the general, but Rossi's obvious loyalty to America rather than Italy represented a betrayal of ethnic solidarity that fascist theory claimed was impossible. "My nonno came from Calabria," Rossi explained during one of their conversations, using the Italian word for grandfather while speaking primarily in English. "He always said America gave our family opportunities that Italy never could. My cousins still live in the old country, but they don't have the chances I have here." The comment reflected broader questions about national identity and loyalty that Graziani had never previously considered. The idea that people could maintain cultural connections to their ancestral homelands while developing primary loyalty to adopted countries contradicted fascist theories about the primacy of blood and soil in determining political allegiance. The letters that Graziani was permitted to write to his family in Italy, subject to military censorship, began to reveal his growing confusion about American society and its implications for the war's outcome. His wife's responses, when they arrived months later, reflected the shock that his observations were creating among fascist true believers in Italy. "Your descriptions of American society are difficult to understand," his wife Rosa wrote in November 1943. "How can a nation without racial purity achieve the military success we have witnessed. The party teaches us that diversity weakens rather than strengthens, yet you describe coordination and effectiveness that seems to contradict this truth. The correspondence reflected broader questions about fascist ideology that would become increasingly difficult to answer as the war progressed and American capabilities became more apparent. The evidence that Graziani was accumulating about democratic society's effectiveness would eventually force him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about political organization and national strength. The industrial tours that were organized as part of Graziani's educational program provided the most dramatic evidence of American productive capacity and its relationship to social diversity. The aircraft factories, shipyards, and ammunition plants that he visited operated on scales that dwarfed anything in Italian industry, but more importantly, they utilized workforce diversity that fascist theory claimed would be impossible to manage effectively. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, where B-24 bombers were being produced at unprecedented rates, Graziani observed assembly lines staffed by workers whose backgrounds represented a cross-section of global immigration to America. Polish machinists worked alongside Italian welders. Jewish engineers supervised production crews that included recent arrivals from rural America, and African-American workers operated complex machinery in positions of significant responsibility. "How is this possible?" he asked his escort, Major William Thompson, while watching a production crew that included what appeared to be representatives of a dozen different ethnic groups working with obvious coordination and effectiveness. "In Italy, we believe that such diversity creates conflict and inefficiency. Yet here I see productivity that exceeds anything our factories have achieved." Major Thompson's response reflected American confidence in democratic values that had been tested and proven effective. "General, we've learned that people work best when they feel they have a stake in the outcome. These workers aren't just building bombers. They're building a country where their children can have better lives than they did. That motivation is more powerful than any ideology." The conversation provided Graziani with insights into democratic motivation that challenged fascist assumptions about the sources of national strength. The idea that voluntary cooperation based on shared values could be more effective than compulsion based on hierarchy represented a fundamental challenge to everything he had been taught about political organization. As autumn turned to winter in 1943, Graziani's letters and journal entries began to reflect a profound intellectual crisis that would ultimately lead him to question not only fascist ideology, but also his own role in supporting a political system that seemed increasingly doomed to failure. The evidence of American strength rooted in diversity was becoming impossible to deny or explain away through fascist theory. The transformation beginning in Graziani's thinking would accelerate as he gained more exposure to American society and its wartime achievements. His journey from fascist true believer to reluctant admirer of democratic values would provide insights into both the appeal and ultimate failure of totalitarian ideology when confronted with the reality of human diversity and democratic possibility. The harsh Massachusetts winter of 1943 brought General Alfredo Graziani face to face with aspects of American society that shattered his remaining faith in fascist ideology more completely than any military defeat could have accomplished. Standing in the observation deck of a Boeing aircraft factory outside Boston, watching women in coveralls operating complex machinery while African-American supervisors coordinated production schedules, the Italian general felt his worldview crumbling like the defenses at El Alamein. "Impossible," he whispered in Italian, unconsciously gripping the railing as he watched a young black woman, barely 20 years old, inspecting bomber engines with the authority and competence that fascist theory claimed was reserved for Aryan males. Everything we were taught about racial capabilities, about women's limitations, it's all false. Colonel James Patterson, who had become something approaching a friend despite their enemy status, observed Graziani's obvious distress with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. The intellectual collapse of fascist ideology was clearly more traumatic for the Italian general than his military capture had been, representing the destruction of beliefs that had shaped his entire adult life. "General," Patterson said gently, "what you're seeing represents America's greatest strength. We don't waste human talent because of prejudice about race or gender. Every person who can contribute to victory is given the opportunity to do so. That's why we're winning this war." The statement, delivered without malice or propaganda fervor, struck Graziani with the force of revelation. His military training had taught him to analyze enemy capabilities objectively, and the evidence before his eyes suggested that American productive capacity was based on principles that made Fascist Italy's approach seem not just morally wrong, but strategically stupid. His journal entry that evening revealed the depth of his intellectual crisis. "Today, I witnessed Negro women supervising white male workers in positions of genuine authority. Jewish engineers designing aircraft that will bomb German cities. Immigrant workers whose loyalty to America exceeds anything I have seen among native-born Italians for our own country. How can our theories explain such phenomena? More troubling, how can we compete with a society that utilizes all its human resources while we waste them through prejudice?" The revelation that America's military superiority might be rooted in social equality rather than technological advantage represented a fundamental challenge to everything Graziani had believed about the sources of national power. The implications for Italy's chances of victory were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly hopeless. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a Jewish psychiatrist from New York who had volunteered to work with prisoner rehabilitation programs, had been observing Graziani's psychological transformation with professional fascination. Her sessions with the Italian general, conducted in German, which they both spoke fluently, provided insights into the collapse of totalitarian ideology when confronted with democratic reality. "General," she said, during one of their weekly conversations, "you seem troubled by what you're observing here. Would you like to discuss your thoughts about American society?" Graziani's response revealed the intellectual honesty that would ultimately make his transformation possible. "Doctor, I am trained to assess enemy capabilities accurately. What I see here suggests that everything we believed about racial hierarchy and social organization was not merely wrong, but catastrophically counterproductive. We have been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs by our own prejudices." The admission represented a crucial breakthrough in Graziani's understanding of the war's true nature. Rather than a conflict between competing military forces, he was beginning to recognize it as a struggle between fundamentally different approaches to organizing human society. With democratic inclusion proving superior to fascist exclusion, the diversity of Fort Devon's personnel had become a daily source of amazement and education for Graziani, who found himself learning about American society through conversations with soldiers whose backgrounds would have made them outcasts or victims in fascist Italy. Each interaction challenged another aspect of the racist ideology that had shaped his military career. Lieutenant David Goldberg, a rabbi's son from Brooklyn who served as the base's Protestant chaplain after converting to Christianity, represented the kind of religious and ethnic complexity that fascist theory claimed was impossible to manage. His ability to counsel soldiers from various faith backgrounds while maintaining his own spiritual integrity demonstrated possibilities for pluralistic society that Graziani had never imagined. "My father thinks I'm crazy for becoming a Christian minister," Goldberg told Graziani during one of their discussions about religion and military service. "But America gives me the freedom to choose my own path while still honoring my heritage. That's what we're fighting for, the right of every person to determine their own destiny." The concept of individual choice in matters of fundamental identity represented another challenge to fascist assumptions about the importance of collective conformity for social stability. The evidence that diverse religious and ethnic communities could coexist peacefully while maintaining their distinct identities contradicted everything Graziani had been taught about the necessity of homogeneity for national strength. The African American officers he encountered provided the most dramatic challenge to racial theories that had shaped fascist ideology. Captain Charles Drew, a physician whose research on blood plasma had revolutionized battlefield medicine, represented intellectual achievement that Italian racial propaganda claimed was impossible for people of African descent. "Dr. Drew?" Graziani asked during a medical consultation. "Your work on blood preservation? It has saved many lives, including perhaps some Italian soldiers who were treated with American medical supplies. How do you reconcile serving people who may have considered you their enemy?" Drew's response revealed the moral complexity that democratic societies could accommodate. "General, I'm a physician first and a soldier second. My job is to heal people, not to judge them. If my research helps save lives, then I've served the cause of humanity regardless of nationality or politics. The conversation provided Graziani with insights into democratic values that transcended national boundaries and racial categories. The idea that professional excellence and moral commitment could override political allegiances represented a form of patriotism that fascist ideology could not comprehend or duplicate. The women serving in various military roles provided another source of amazement for a general who had been raised in a culture that viewed female participation in warfare as evidence of social decay. The Women's Army Corps personnel he encountered daily demonstrated competence in roles that fascist theory claimed were reserved for men. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, a Mexican-American officer who supervised logistics operations for the entire base, managed supply chains that kept thousands of soldiers equipped and fed with efficiency that exceeded anything Graziani had seen in Italian military service. Her authority over male subordinates was accepted without question, suggesting that American military culture had transcended gender limitations that still constrained European armies. Colonel Martinez, Graziani observed during a tour of the base's supply operations, "Your organizational systems are more sophisticated than anything I encountered in the Italian army. How did you develop such expertise?" Her response reflected the meritocratic principles that made American military service different from European class-based systems. "General, I started as a clerk and worked my way up through demonstrated competence. The army promoted me because I could do the job, not because of my family connections or political loyalty. That's how we build effective organizations." The contrast with Italian military promotion systems, which prioritized political reliability and social status over professional competence, provided another explanation for American military superiority that had nothing to do with industrial capacity or technological advantage. Democratic armies that promoted based on merit rather than privilege simply functioned more effectively than fascist forces constrained by ideology. The factory visits that continued throughout the winter provided ongoing education about the relationship between social diversity and productive capacity. Each facility Graziani toured demonstrated organizational principles that contradicted fascist assumptions about the inefficiency of democratic management and diverse workforces. At a naval shipyard in Boston, he observed construction crews that included recent immigrants who barely spoke English working alongside third-generation Americans, with Italian-American welders collaborating effectively with Irish-American electricians and Polish-American machinists. The coordination of their efforts produced ships at rates that Italian industry could never have matched. "These workers," he noted in his journal, "demonstrate loyalty to America that exceeds anything I have observed among Italian workers for our own country. They work with enthusiasm and pride that suggests genuine commitment to the war effort rather than mere compulsion. Their diversity appears to strengthen rather than weaken their effectiveness." The observation forced Graziani to confront uncomfortable questions about the sources of national loyalty and the effectiveness of different approaches to social organization. The evidence suggested that voluntary commitment based on shared democratic values produced better results than coerced compliance based on fascist ideology. The educational programs that had been designed for his benefit included lectures by prominent American intellectuals who explained democratic theory and its practical applications. These sessions provided theoretical frameworks for understanding the phenomena he was observing while challenging the intellectual foundations of fascist ideology. Professor Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, who had volunteered to educate high-value prisoners, delivered a series of lectures on democratic government that directly addressed fascist criticisms of pluralistic society. His arguments combined philosophical reasoning with practical evidence that democracy could achieve both individual freedom and collective effectiveness. "General," Hutchins explained during one session, "fascist theory assumes that diversity creates weakness and conflict, but our experience demonstrates the opposite, that different perspectives and backgrounds contribute to better decision-making and more innovative solutions to complex problems. Homogeneity breeds stagnation, while diversity promotes progress." The lectures provided intellectual tools for understanding American society that helped Graziani process his observations more systematically. The combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience was gradually convincing him that democratic principles were not just morally superior to fascist ideology, but also more effective for achieving national objectives. The correspondence he maintained with family and former colleagues in Italy began to reflect his changing perspective, though he was careful to avoid explicit criticism of fascist ideology that might endanger his wife and children. His letters described American society in terms that raised questions about Italian assumptions without directly challenging party doctrine. "The American military organization differs significantly from our own," he wrote to his former aide-de-camp in March 1944. "They promote officers based on demonstrated competence rather than political loyalty or social background. Their workforce includes people of many different backgrounds working together with remarkable effectiveness. I am studying their methods to understand how they have achieved such productivity." The carefully neutral language concealed observations that were profoundly subversive of fascist ideology. His growing understanding of democratic effectiveness was making him question not only Italy's chances of military victory, but also the fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that underpinned the fascist state. A spring arrived in 1944, bringing news of German defeats and Allied advances that made Axis victory increasingly impossible. Graziani faced the prospect of spending the remainder of the war in a country whose superiority he was beginning to understand had nothing to do with material advantages, and everything to do with social principles that Italy had rejected in favor of fascist ideology. The transformation in his thinking would accelerate as he gained access to more information about the war's progress and the comparative effectiveness of democratic versus totalitarian societies in mobilizing for total conflict. His journey from fascist true believer to reluctant admirer of democratic values was approaching a crisis that would force him to choose between loyalty to ideology and commitment to truth. The sweltering summer of 1944 brought General Alfredo Graziani to what he would later describe as the darkest period of his life, not because of his captivity, but because of the unavoidable conclusion that everything he had devoted his career to defending was not only morally wrong but strategically suicidal. Standing in the heat of a Detroit automobile plant that had been converted to tank production, watching Italian Americans build the very Sherman tanks that were crushing Axis forces in Normandy, he felt the final collapse of his faith in fascist ideology. "Those are my countrymen," he whispered to Colonel Patterson, gesturing toward workers whose names, Benedetti, Marconi, Rossi, were painted on the tanks they had assembled. In Italy, they would have been peasants or small shopkeepers. Here they are building the most advanced military equipment in the world. How did we lose so much human potential to America? The question reflected a fundamental shift in Graziani's understanding of the war's nature. Rather than viewing it as a conflict between competing military forces, he now recognized it as a struggle between different approaches to organizing human society, with democratic inclusion proving devastatingly superior to fascist exclusion in every measurable way. Colonel Patterson's response was gentle but pointed. "General, these workers aren't building tanks just because they're paid to do so. They're building them because they believe in what America represents: opportunity, freedom, dignity for all people, regardless of their background. That motivation is worth more than all the propaganda in the world." The observation struck Graziani with particular force because it explained something that had puzzled him throughout his captivity: the obvious enthusiasm and commitment displayed by American workers, soldiers, and civilians of all backgrounds. Unlike the fearful compliance he had observed in fascist Italy, American patriotism appeared to be based on genuine affection for democratic values rather than intimidation by authoritarian power. His journal entry that evening revealed the depth of his intellectual transformation. "Today I understood why we are losing this war. It is not because Americans have better weapons or more factories, though they have both. It is because they have unleashed the full potential of their people, while we have deliberately constrained ours through prejudice and ideology. Every Italian-American building tanks for the Allied cause represents a resource that fascist Italy drove away through its policies of exclusion and hatred." The realization that fascist ideology had not merely failed morally, but had also been counterproductive, strategically represented the final destruction of Graziani's worldview. His military training had taught him to analyze enemy capabilities objectively, and the evidence before his eyes suggested that democratic societies possessed inherent advantages that made fascist victory impossible, regardless of tactical considerations. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison had been documenting Graziani's psychological transformation through their weekly sessions, recognizing that his case represented a unique opportunity to study the collapse of totalitarian ideology when confronted with democratic reality. Her notes from this period revealed the intellectual honesty that made his transformation both painful and complete. "The general has reached what we might call ideological rock bottom," she wrote in her assessment. "He can no longer maintain any illusions about fascist superiority when faced with overwhelming evidence of democratic effectiveness. His military mind compels him to acknowledge reality, even when that reality destroys everything he previously believed about politics and society." The emotional cost of this intellectual transformation was evident in Graziani's increasing isolation from other Italian prisoners who maintained their fascist beliefs despite mounting evidence of Axis defeat. His reputation as a traitor to fascist ideology made him suspect among prisoners who preferred comfortable delusions to uncomfortable truths about their political system's failures. The news from Italy during this period provided additional evidence that fascist ideology was collapsing under the weight of military defeat and social breakdown. The fall of Mussolini in July 1943 had been followed by civil war, German occupation, and the kind of social chaos that democratic societies had avoided despite facing similar military pressures. Lieutenant Giuseppe Moretti, a younger Italian officer who still maintained faith in fascist principles, provided a useful counterpoint to Graziani's evolving views during their conversations in the prisoner compound. Moretti's arguments reflected the kind of ideological reasoning that Graziani himself had once employed to explain away evidence that contradicted fascist theory. "General," Moretti argued during one of their heated discussions, "what we see here is temporary success built on materialism and racial mixing that will ultimately destroy American society from within. Fascist principles may face temporary setbacks, but they represent eternal truths about human nature and social organization that will ultimately prevail." Graziani's response revealed how completely his thinking had changed. "Lieutenant, I once believed such things myself, but observe what this racial mixing has accomplished. Productive capacity that dwarfs anything Europe has achieved, military effectiveness that has driven German forces from Africa to the gates of Berlin, social cohesion that has survived years of total war without the kind of collapse we are witnessing in Italy. Perhaps we should consider that our eternal truths were actually eternal errors." The exchange illustrated the intellectual chasm that was developing between prisoners who maintained ideological faith and those who accepted empirical evidence about fascist failure. Graziani's transformation was making him a figure of suspicion among his fellow officers, while earning him grudging respect from American personnel who recognized his intellectual courage. The factory visits that continued throughout 1944 provided ongoing education about the practical advantages of democratic social organization. Each facility demonstrated principles of inclusive management and diverse workforce utilization that contradicted everything Graziani had been taught about efficient industrial organization. At an aircraft engine plant in Connecticut, he observed production lines supervised by a team that included a Jewish refugee engineer from Germany, an African-American physicist from Tuskegee Institute, and a Polish-American mechanic who had learned advanced manufacturing techniques through company-sponsored education programs. Their coordination produced aircraft engines with performance specifications that exceeded anything in Axis inventories. In Italy, Graziani observed to his escort, Major Thompson, such people would never work together as equals. Jews would be excluded, Africans would be considered incapable of technical work, and immigrants would be viewed with suspicion. Yet here they collaborate to produce weapons that are defeating our forces throughout Europe and the Pacific. Major Thompson's response reflected American confidence in democratic principles that had been tested under the most challenging circumstances. "General, we've learned that prejudice is a luxury we can't afford. When you're fighting for survival, you use every available talent regardless of the package it comes in. That practical approach has become our greatest strategic advantage." The conversation provided Graziani with insights into the relationship between democratic values and military effectiveness that completely reframed his understanding of the war's likely outcome. The evidence suggested that societies organized around inclusion and merit would inevitably defeat those constrained by exclusion and prejudice, regardless of temporary tactical advantages. The African-American units he encountered during base visits provided the most dramatic challenge to racial theories that had shaped fascist ideology. The Tuskegee Airmen, whose combat record in escorting bomber formations had exceeded that of white fighter squadrons, represented military excellence that Italian racial propaganda claimed was impossible for people of African descent. Captain Benjamin Davis, Jr., whose father had been the first black general in U.S. Army history, exemplified the kind of military leadership that fascist theory insisted could not emerge from racially diverse societies. His obvious competence and the respect he commanded from both black and white personnel demonstrated possibilities for military organization that Italy had never explored. Captain Davis, Graziani asked during a discussion about aerial combat tactics, "Your squadron's record suggests exceptional performance under the most challenging conditions. How do you account for such effectiveness?" Davis's response revealed the motivational advantages that democratic societies could generate. "General, my pilots fight not just for America, but for the principle that ability rather than ancestry should determine a person's opportunities. When you're fighting for your own dignity, as well as your country's victory, you tend to perform at the highest possible level." The explanation provided Graziani with insights into democratic motivation that fascist ideology could neither understand nor duplicate. The idea that oppressed groups would fight more effectively for societies that offered genuine equality represented a source of national strength that totalitarian systems had systematically excluded from their calculations. The women serving in increasingly responsible military roles provided another source of amazement for a general who had been raised to view female participation in warfare as evidence of social decay. The WAVES, WACS, and other women's military organizations he encountered demonstrated competence in roles that fascist theory claimed were beyond female capabilities. Commander Grace Hopper, a mathematician and computer programmer whose work on early calculating machines was revolutionizing military logistics, represented intellectual achievement that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. Her development of programming languages that enabled rapid calculation of artillery trajectories and supply requirements provided tactical advantages that were helping win the war. "Commander Hopper," Graziani observed during a tour of the computing facility, "your mathematical work appears to have direct applications for military effectiveness. In Italy, women are not considered capable of such technical contributions to warfare." Hopper's response reflected the matter-of-fact approach to gender equality that characterized American military service. "General, mathematics doesn't care about the gender of the person doing the calculations. If my work helps save lives and win battles, then the military benefits regardless of whether I'm male or female. Practical results matter more than theoretical prejudices." The conversation provided another example of how democratic societies achieved superior performance by utilizing all available human resources, rather than constraining them through ideological limitations. The cumulative effect of such advantages was becoming impossible for Graziani to ignore or explain away through fascist theory. The correspondence he maintained with his family in Italy began to reflect his changing perspective more explicitly as the war's outcome became increasingly obvious. His letters described American society in terms that directly challenged fascist assumptions while avoiding criticism that might endanger his loved ones under German occupation. The American approach to military organization differs fundamentally from European traditions, he wrote to his wife Rosa in October 1944. "They promote based on competence rather than birth, utilize personnel regardless of background, and achieve coordination through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive discipline. Their methods produce results that suggest we may have misunderstood the sources of national strength." The carefully diplomatic language concealed observations that were profoundly subversive of fascist ideology. His growing understanding of democratic effectiveness was forcing him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own role in supporting a political system that had proven both morally bankrupt and strategically incompetent. The news of continued German defeats and the liberation of concentration camps provided final evidence that fascist ideology represented not just political error, but moral evil on an unprecedented scale. The photographs and testimonies emerging from liberated camps forced Graziani to confront the ultimate consequences of the racial theories he had once supported. "I understand now why we deserved to lose this war," he wrote in his journal after viewing newsreel footage from Bergen-Belsen. "A political system that can conceive and implement such systematic evil has forfeited any claim to legitimacy or survival. My shame is not in being captured by the Allies, but in serving a cause that led to such horrors." The moral reckoning that accompanied his intellectual transformation was perhaps more painful than the destruction of his political beliefs. The recognition that he had devoted his career to defending a system capable of genocide created psychological trauma that would influence his thinking for the remainder of his life. As winter approached in 1944, bringing news of Germany's final desperate offensive in the Ardennes and Japan's increasing isolation in the Pacific, Graziani faced the prospect of eventual repatriation to an Italy that would need to rebuild not only its physical infrastructure, but also its moral and political foundations. His transformation from fascist true believer to democratic convert positioned him to contribute to that reconstruction, but it also isolated him from countrymen who preferred familiar lies to uncomfortable truths. The knowledge he had gained about democratic society and its advantages would prove valuable for Italy's post-war reconstruction, but his journey from enemy general to reluctant admirer of American values represented a personal transformation that transcended political considerations to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the possibility of redemption after moral failure. The spring of 1945 brought General Alfredo Graziani to a moment of reckoning that would define the remainder of his life. As news of Germany's collapse and Hitler's suicide reached Fort Devens, the Italian general found himself confronting not only the complete military defeat of fascism, but also the moral obligation to help rebuild his shattered homeland on foundations that contradicted everything he had once believed about politics and society. Standing in the camp's library, surrounded by American newspapers celebrating victory in Europe, while reporting the horrors discovered in liberated concentration camps, Graziani felt the full weight of his intellectual and moral transformation. The evidence of fascist evil was no longer something he could rationalize or minimize. It demanded acknowledgement and atonement that would require rejecting his entire previous worldview. "Colonel Patterson," he said to his longtime escort and unexpected friend, "I need to write a comprehensive report about what I have learned here, not for military intelligence purposes, but for my own countrymen who will need to understand why fascism failed and what alternatives exist for organizing a just society." Patterson's response reflected both professional satisfaction and personal affection for the prisoner who had become more student than enemy. "General, your observations could prove invaluable for helping Italy transition to democratic government. Your military reputation and obvious sincerity might help convince Italians that democracy represents strength rather than weakness." The project that Graziani began that spring would eventually become a detailed analysis of American society and its implications for European reconstruction. His unique perspective as a high-ranking fascist officer who had experienced democratic society firsthand provided insights that purely theoretical critiques of totalitarianism could never achieve. His preliminary notes revealed the systematic nature of his intellectual transformation. Democratic societies achieve superior performance, not despite their diversity, but because of it. By utilizing all available human resources, regardless of race, religion, or gender, America has accessed human potential that fascist ideology systematically excluded. Every Jewish scientist developing new weapons, every African-American pilot protecting bombers, every immigrant worker building tanks represents talent that Italy drove away through prejudice. We defeated ourselves through our own hatred. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison had been documenting Graziani's psychological transformation throughout his captivity, recognizing that his case represented a unique opportunity to study the complete intellectual collapse of totalitarian ideology when confronted with democratic reality. Her final assessment would influence post-war approaches to denazification and democratic re-education throughout Europe. General Graziani has undergone what can only be described as a complete ideological conversion, she wrote in her comprehensive report. His transformation from fascist true believer to democratic advocate appears genuine and permanent, based not on opportunistic adaptation to circumstances, but on rational analysis of empirical evidence. His case suggests that intelligent individuals can overcome even the most comprehensive ideological indoctrination when presented with sustained exposure to alternative social models. The implications of Morrison's findings extended far beyond individual psychology to influence American planning for post-war reconstruction. If high-ranking fascist officers could genuinely convert to democratic principles through education and exposure, then broader transformation of Axis societies might be possible through systematic programs of democratic demonstration rather than mere punishment and occupation. The news of Mussolini's death and the final collapse of the Italian Social Republic reached Fort Devens in late April 1945, creating complex emotions for Italian prisoners who faced the prospect of returning to a homeland that no longer existed in any recognizable form. For Graziani, the end of fascist Italy represented both personal liberation and profound responsibility to help build something better from the ruins. Lieutenant Giuseppe Moretti, the younger officer who had maintained fascist beliefs despite mounting evidence of their failure, finally approached Graziani with questions that revealed his own growing doubts about totalitarian ideology. The conversation that followed would prove crucial for both men's understanding of their responsibilities as Italians facing an uncertain future. "General," Moretti said quietly, "I have been watching your transformation over these months, and I confess that I no longer understand what we were fighting for. If everything you now say about democratic society is true, then we have wasted our lives defending ideas that made Italy weaker rather than stronger." Graziani's response reflected both intellectual honesty and compassionate understanding of the psychological difficulty involved in abandoning deeply held beliefs. "Giuseppe, I once believed, as you did, that fascist principles represented eternal truths about human nature and social organization. But observe what democratic values have accomplished here: productive capacity that dwarfs anything we achieved, military effectiveness that has crushed fascist forces everywhere, social cohesion that has survived years of total war without the kind of collapse we witnessed in Italy. Perhaps our eternal truths were actually eternal errors." The exchange marked a turning point, not only for Moretti, but for other Italian prisoners who had been observing Graziani's transformation with mixture of suspicion and curiosity. His obvious sincerity and systematic reasoning began to convince fellow officers that his conversion represented genuine intellectual evolution rather than opportunistic accommodation to circumstances. The educational programs that had been designed for Graziani's benefit expanded to include other Italian prisoners, as American officials recognized the value of creating cadres of democratically educated officers who could contribute to Italy's post-war reconstruction. These sessions provided theoretical frameworks for understanding the practical advantages of democratic society that they had all observed during their captivity. Professor Robert Hutchins continued his lectures on democratic theory, now addressing groups of Italian officers who represented different stages of ideological transformation. His arguments combined philosophical reasoning with practical evidence that democracy could achieve both individual freedom and collective effectiveness in ways that fascist ideology had never managed. "Gentlemen," Hutchins explained during one session, "you have seen empirical proof that democratic societies outperform totalitarian ones in every measurable category: economic productivity, military effectiveness, scientific innovation, social stability. This superiority is not accidental, but inherent to systems that utilize all available human talent rather than constraining it through prejudice and fear." The lectures provided intellectual tools for understanding American success that helped the Italian officers process their observations more systematically. The combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience was gradually convincing even the most skeptical prisoners that democratic principles were not just morally superior to fascist ideology, but also more effective for achieving national objectives. The factory visits that continued throughout the spring of 1945 provided ongoing education about the relationship between social diversity and productive capacity. Each facility demonstrated organizational principles that contradicted fascist assumptions about the inefficiency of democratic management and diverse workforces, while revealing the systematic advantages that inclusive societies possessed over exclusive ones. At a Boeing aircraft plant in Seattle, Graziani observed assembly lines where recent immigrants worked alongside multi-generational Americans, with Holocaust survivors from Europe collaborating effectively with Japanese-American workers whose own families had faced internment. The coordination of their efforts produced aircraft at rates that Axis Industries had never approached. These workers demonstrate something that fascist theory claimed was impossible, Graziani noted in his expanding manuscript. People from different backgrounds, races, and religions working together not just peacefully, but enthusiastically toward common goals. Their diversity strengthens rather than weakens their effectiveness, because different perspectives and experiences contribute to better solutions for complex problems. The observation reflected Graziani's growing understanding that democratic societies possessed systematic advantages that made fascist victory impossible, regardless of temporary tactical considerations. The evidence suggested that inclusive social organization was not just morally preferable to exclusion, but also strategically superior in every measurable way. The correspondence he maintained with family and former colleagues in Italy began to reflect his transformation more explicitly as the war ended and political considerations became less important than moral obligations. His letters described American society in terms that directly challenged fascist assumptions while offering hope for Italy's democratic reconstruction. "Rosa," he wrote to his wife in May 1945, "I must tell you honestly that everything we believed about fascist ideology was wrong, not just morally wrong, though the evidence of concentration camps proves that conclusively, but strategically and practically wrong. Democratic societies are stronger, more productive, more innovative, and more resilient than fascist ones, because they utilize all human resources rather than constraining them through hatred and prejudice." The frank admission represented both personal liberation and profound risk, as Italian society struggled with questions of accountability and reconstruction in the aftermath of fascist collapse. Graziani's willingness to acknowledge error publicly would make him controversial among former fascists, while potentially valuable for democratic reconstruction efforts. The repatriation process that began in summer 1945 created opportunities for Graziani to carry his newly acquired understanding of democratic society back to Italy, where it would influence his contribution to post-war reconstruction efforts. His transformation from fascist general to democratic convert positioned him to help build Italian institutions based on principles he had learned to respect during his captivity. The manuscript he had been preparing throughout his final months at Fort Devens would eventually be published as Letters from America, A Fascist General's Education in Democracy, becoming one of the most influential documents in Italy's post-war intellectual development. His systematic analysis of American society and its implications for European reconstruction provided frameworks for understanding democratic advantages that purely theoretical critiques could never achieve. Democracy succeeds where fascism failed because it harnesses human diversity rather than fearing it, he wrote in his concluding chapter. Every person denied opportunity through prejudice represents wasted potential that weakens society as a whole. America has shown that inclusion creates strength, cooperation achieves more than coercion, and societies that trust their citizens are more powerful than those that fear them. The book's publication in 1947 created controversy throughout Europe, as former fascists and their sympathizers rejected Graziani's conclusions, while democratic reformers embraced his systematic critique of totalitarian ideology. His reputation as a military officer, who had experienced both systems firsthand, gave his arguments credibility that academic analyses could never possess. Graziani's return to Italy in autumn 1945 began a new chapter in his life, as he worked to help build democratic institutions in a country devastated by war and moral collapse. His transformation from enemy general to democratic advocate provided evidence that even the most committed ideologues could change when confronted with superior alternatives to their beliefs. The reception he received in Italy was mixed, with former fascists viewing him as a traitor, while democratic politicians recognized his potential value for legitimizing the new political order. His decision to work openly for democratic reconstruction, despite personal risks and social ostracism, reflected the depth of his intellectual transformation and moral commitment to helping Italy build a better future. His work with the Christian Democratic Party in developing Italy's new constitution incorporated lessons he had learned about democratic society during his American captivity. The emphasis on individual rights, religious tolerance, and inclusive citizenship that characterized Italy's post-war constitutional development reflected principles that Graziani had observed working effectively in practice rather than merely existing in theory. The educational programs he established for former military officers and civil servants drew heavily on his American experiences to demonstrate the practical advantages of democratic governance. His systematic presentation of evidence that inclusive societies outperformed exclusive ones helped convince skeptical audiences that democracy represented strength rather than weakness. "I have seen the future of successful societies," he told audiences throughout Italy during his speaking tours, "and it belongs to those nations that utilize all their human resources rather than constraining them through prejudice." America defeated fascism not just through superior weapons, but through superior social organization that unleashed human potential we had systematically suppressed. The lectures provided Italian audiences with first-hand testimony about democratic effectiveness that helped counter lingering fascist propaganda about American weakness and decadence. Graziani's military credentials and obvious sincerity made his arguments particularly effective with audiences who might have dismissed similar claims from purely academic sources. His role in Italy's NATO membership negotiations reflected his understanding of democratic alliances as fundamentally different from fascist partnerships. Rather than relationships based on domination and subordination, he had observed that democratic cooperation could achieve collective strength while preserving individual nations' sovereignty and dignity. The Atlantic Alliance represented for Graziani the international extension of principles he had observed working effectively within American society, diverse partners contributing different strengths toward common objectives while maintaining their distinct identities and interests. His advocacy for Italian participation in democratic institutions helped legitimize Italy's integration into Western security and economic systems. By 1960, Graziani's transformation from fascist general to democratic statesman had become a symbol of Italy's successful transition from totalitarian dictatorship to stable democracy. His systematic documentation of democratic advantages and his practical work in building inclusive institutions had contributed significantly to Italy's post-war reconstruction and international rehabilitation. The personal relationships he had maintained with American military personnel from his captivity period continued throughout his life, providing ongoing channels for cultural and political exchange that facilitated Italy's integration into Western democratic institutions. These friendships demonstrated that former enemies could become genuine allies when they shared common commitments to human dignity and democratic values. Graziani's memoir, completed shortly before his death in 1982, reflected on the transformation that had shaped his post-war life. "My captivity in America was the most educative experience of my life, teaching me that strength comes from inclusion rather than exclusion, that diversity creates advantages rather than problems, and that societies built on respect for human dignity will always defeat those based on hatred and fear. Italy's future prosperity and security depend on our continued commitment to these democratic principles that I was privileged to observe in practice." The legacy of Graziani's intellectual transformation extended beyond his individual contribution to Italy's democratic development to influence broader understanding of the possibilities for political conversion and moral redemption. His case demonstrated that even the most committed ideologues could change when presented with sustained exposure to superior alternatives, providing hope for democratic transformation in other post-conflict societies. The extraordinary story of General Alfredo Graziani reveals one of World War II's most profound ideological transformations. This high-ranking fascist officer, captured in North Africa and brought to America, experienced a complete intellectual revolution that would reshape his understanding of power, society, and human potential. Now, from his initial shock at seeing diverse Americans working together as equals, to his eventual recognition that Italy's defeat was rooted in fascist ideology's systematic waste of human talent, Graziani's journey challenges us to consider how prejudice weakens societies while inclusion creates strength. His transformation from enemy general to democratic advocate demonstrates that even the deepest ideological commitments can change when confronted with overwhelming evidence of superior alternatives. What struck you most about Graziani's gradual realization that America's diversity was actually its greatest strength? Were you surprised that a fascist general could undergo such a complete intellectual transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments about how exposure to different societies can challenge our assumptions about politics and human nature. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button for more incredible stories of how individual encounters with democracy changed the course of history.